So what is a tariff and how does it work? When the U.S. imposes a tariff, the flow of money involves specific stakeholders and government processes. Here's the exact sequence. Payment and collection. So the importer, so let's just suppose we have an order coming off a boat for $10 million and it just landed at Los Angeles Harbor from China. And there's an importer that gets those goods. Now that importer pays the tariffs. That's somebody on our soil. American companies importing goods pay the tariff as a percentage of the product's value or a fixed rate per unit. It's going to be the former for the current tariffs that Trump has in place. This occurs when goods enter a U.S. port of entry, and I just mentioned Los Angeles because it's the biggest one in America. U.S. Customs and Border Protection collect the tariff, and agents classify the goods verified by their declared value and assess the tariff amount using the U.S. Harmonized Tariff Schedule. I'm not going to go into that, but you can now Google that phrase if it would interest you, okay? Importers self-report this information, but the CBP audits them periodically. That revenue that is collected by the CBP enters the U.S. Treasury, and those collected funds are deposited into the general fund of the USA, becoming part of the federal budget. I bet you didn't know that. All right. So that money comes from the U.S. So China hasn't paid a nickel at this moment, right? That 100 million or 10 million, whatever it was, and let's say that 2 million of that is tariffs, it's going to be more because of the amount of tariffs that are in place against China. That goes into the U.S. Treasury for the Treasury to spend any way that it wants. And let's talk about that. So what's the allocation and use? General government spending. So the tariff revenue is not earmarked for specific programs and can fund any federal expenditure, from infrastructure to defense. And for that matter, social programs and welfare programs and anything that the current administration, that doesn't mean necessarily the Trump administration, but if these tariffs somehow are still in place for the next president, they'll stay doing what they're doing until the current president at that time changes the flow of monies. So targeted relief, this is an actual example in 2018 that happened. Sometimes these tariffs subsidize industries like farmers. You mentioned this earlier, Dr. J, that maybe these farmers are going to need some help with the market. Well, they also could be subsidized like they were 7 years ago during the U.S.-China trade war of 2018. Maybe you didn't remember that. We weren't doing the show in 2018. We didn't start till 2020, but it's not new for the U.S. and China to be in a trade war because of the disparity, because of the import-export imbalance. It's just that this time, this president has said enough. All right. Budget deficit reduction or tax cuts. So while tariffs contribute plus or minus 2% of total federal revenue, which is not that much. All right. We're seeing all this enormous tariffs is going to just bankrupt people. It's 2%. It's 2%. It's just not a large portion. All right. They could offset a small portion of the proposed tax cuts or deficit spending. I would like to see them actually go in and reduce the debt, not the deficit, because that takes Congress, but the debt. Literally just Treasury could say, yep, we're just going to allocate $500 billion to go against the debt. And if you do that long enough, maybe over 15 years, we'll get the debt to zero. That would be good. All right, so economic impact. So the cost distribution, importers often pass tariff costs to consumers. Via higher prices, retailers and wholesalers may absorb some costs, reducing profit margins. However, there is another choice here, and that is that people say, I am not going to pay $2,300 for an iPhone. No, send it back. And then the importer goes, we should have checked with our end retailers. And of course, I'm being facetious. Of course, they check with their end retailers. They're on the phone with them saying, hey, we've got this order here. I'm having to pay this money up front. You going to pick it up? And if you're going to send it back to me, then I got to put it back on the boat. So it definitely complicates the life of the importers. All right. That's just the reality. So China, again, so far has paid nothing. What has happened, though, is that the importers at this point push back and say, you know what, we're not accepting this because we can't sell it. So just put it back on the boat and send it back. Now you have China's attention. And the factory orders are plummeting over there, and the people are not working. If you don't believe me, we can talk about that. It's kind of beyond the scope of financial commentary, which is what I'm doing here. But everything I've talked about so far affects the markets. And again, I'm kind of on a vigilante role here to show you how these work so that it reduces your angst about this tariff war. This is temporary. It's been done before as recently as 2018. That was not as bad as this one because this one involves literally every country on the planet. And as some have pointed out, even some islands that only have penguins, they've been tariffed too. So almost kind of funny. So global effects, all right? Tariffs can alter trade patterns, incentivize domestic production, and that is the key. Incentivize domestic production. We want more goods and services like pharmaceuticals, like rare earths, like lithium development. Now, we don't have much lithium right here, but there are other islands in the Atlantic that do, but I digress, all right? But local domestic production within the borders of the United States, that is what Mr. Trump wants to see. And consumers can reject buying products that are no longer perceived to carry a fair value, i.e. too expensive, and that is already happening. So the idea that a consumer is going to be pinched by something they have to buy, these are mostly consumable goods. These tariffs are not coming in on food products unless it's, French wines or chocolate from Switzerland, all right? Not exactly staples that we have to have. So that's why there's not that much risk here as far as discomfort to the consumer. This process underscores that tariffs function as a tax. That is true on U.S. importers and consumers if they choose to spend. The importers have to pay it or they can't get it off the boat. But at some point, the U.S. importers say, you know what, we're done with this. We don't have a market, send it back. And this revenue is managed through the federal budgetary channels. I'm going to pause here because I've talked so much. And you guys ask me anything in the chat that you want, all right? I'll go on to the next screen so you can look at it because we're going to talk about the difference between embargoes and tariffs. I know this might seem a little far-reaching, but you guys have asked for more detail and I'm giving it to you. Again, the purpose of this episode tonight is with everything you're hearing in the media to make you feel more at ease and comfortable that this is a short window in time we're going through. We have been here before, most recently 2018, and it will pass. So why are high tariffs called the equivalent of an embargo? Well, one is a legal situation and the other is a financial situation. So in the current context of the trade conflict with the U.S. and China, tariffs have reached an unprecedented 145% entering the U.S. and 125% on U.S. goods entering China. It's crazy, unsustainable. So at these rates, the cost of importing goods becomes so high that trade is effectively stopped. Why? Because the importers are saying, just like I told you, hey, we're not going to pay this because we don't have consumers that'll buy it from us. And we're not going to be left holding this inventory all marked up. If the tariffs go away, then we've paid X amount for this inventory and already sent our check to the Treasury and we can't get it back. All right. So the importers are the key player in this, not the country that's being tariffed against. It's the U.S. Importer. So that's why top officials, primarily Treasury Secretary, all right, Scott Bessent, have repeatedly said 145, 125, these levels are the equivalent of an embargo because even though it's not legally saying you can't buy this, they're high enough that they're the equivalent or the proxy of an embargo. We don't want to decouple. What we want is fair trade. That is what I've been saying throughout. Obviously, Donald Trump has hired people to work for him on his cabinet, in his major departments, his secretaries that agree with his point of view. And there are quite a few of us out there that are tired of this imbalance, tired of America being taken advantage of, and want to see this change and realize that there's going to be some discomfort. It's not going to be permanent. You got to believe me on that. It is not going to be permanent, all right? When tariffs are set so high that they make imports unaffordable or uncompetitive, the practical effect is to call them an embargo. Trades in those goods essentially ceases. But are they the same? No, they're not, because tariffs do not legally prohibit trade, but they can make it economically unviable. An embargo, on the other hand, says you cannot ship X to X. This happened with chips, all right? NVIDIA, where NVIDIA was told, we're going to embargo your chips to a given country, probably North Korea. You can't ship them there, all right? If you do, you're going to face a felony. All right, that is an embargo. And NVIDIA could say, well, we'll just make them, 6 times the cost of what they're paying for them in South Korea. And the U.S. government can say, no, you can't. You can't do that. You're on our soil. Now, they don't have that kind of control over Roche Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. You can't tell Roche Pharmaceuticals, who's domesticated in Switzerland, what to do. But you can tell NVIDIA. Make sense? All right. So in practice, when tariffs are set at levels like this 125, 145, the result is very little, if any, trade occurring and mirroring essentially an embargo's impact. However, unlike embargoes, tariffs theoretically still allow trade if buyers are willing to pay up. All right, but it's an extremely high price. This is a chart that summarizes it. So in conclusion on this segment, while tariffs and embargoes are not technically identical, extremely high tariffs can make trade so impractical that they are the equivalent of an embargo in their real-world effect. This is not just a theoretical or rhetorical comparison. The current U.S. and China tariffs have reduced trade to a trickle, mirroring the consequences, and that's why I brought this to your attention. This is what Donald Trump wanted, okay? This is confusion strategy, which I just mentioned to you earlier. It actually uses a different word for it, but that's essentially the equivalent of it. It's to get them in a panic because they don't know when his end date is. And Scott Bessent has said that. You see, when you interview Mr. CNN, he'll say to them, we know everything. We know what we're going to do, how far we're willing to go, how long we're willing to carry this on. You don't know any of that, nor will you, because why would we tip our hand to you, the media? Even if you were friendly media, because it's just going to go out in the airways and tell our, trading partners. We don't want to do that. We're holding the cards. We have all the cards. This is Scott Bessent. And we're going to use them to the advantage of the United States citizens to get this country where free trade is truly free trade. Questions? Anybody? I want to show you this chart again. What you got to be thinking after we've waded all the way through this. What does this mean for my returns? Well, look back 150 years. Look at the green line. I already showed you this once. Every single time we've had a severe tariff regime, equities have been positive except for during the Great Depression, and then it was only down 3.1%. Now, obviously, stocks were down more than that, but as far as the effect of being down as related to tariffs, actually up almost 12% in the 1980s and 1990s because the rest of the market was strong. So overall effect on the market from tariffs, the point I'm making here is relatively small.